And I said, Tracy, we have to do something about this. And we had extensive discussions over wine about how to do it. And I went back to the EATG and to the BOD and to everyone, and I said, we have to do something about it. We have to do something about it. And people will say, well, maybe it's too early, it's too preliminary, well, whatever. People are dying. We have to start now to do something about it. At least try. We cannot afford not to try. This is basically how the first just meeting started, because a personal feeling that something had to be done. Since then, some friends and colleagues have died. Sorry for that. I remember some people who were in Sitges and who's not with us anymore, who couldn't benefit from the new drugs, and I'm still scary. And I have to confess, I'm scary for Luis, for Diego, for Maxime, for other people. I don't want them to die. And I think we have a personal and ethical commitment as a community, and all the rest, not only as company representatives or regulatory people or researchers, as citizens. As part of this society, you have the moral commitment to do your best to save the life of the people. And this is ultimately the reason for this meeting and for the meetings to come. Thank you very much.
I think before 2007, the situation both to access to treatment and treatments themselves was pretty dire. And a lot of people, certainly in Edinburgh, where I come from, had only found out that they were living with hepatitis C round about the year 2000. The doctors had known for a long time, but they had not bothered to inform their patients because they thought HIV is going to kill you before the hepatitis C, and that was the case in a lot of places. HIV will kill you first, and then by the year 2000, they suddenly rubbed their chins and thought, maybe the HIV isn't going to kill them first, so we'll have to deal with the hepatitis C now. So I think round about 1998, 2000, we realised the enormity of the problem in Scotland.
La stessa emergenza l'avevano Spagna, Portogallo e paesi del sud Europa, dove comunque vi era stata un'infezione da HIV guidata anche dall'uso di sostanze, soprattutto eroina, per vía inyectiva.
En España, por ejemplo, donde era un problema pues, muy grave el de la coinfección y cómo esa coinfección derivaba en cáncer hepático, en cirrosis y en muerte de muchas personas jóvenes que habían superado ya la muerte por el SIDA y ahora se veían abocadas a un segundo duelo de morir por una enfermedad que era devastadora, sobre todo recordaba mucho a los primeros años del SIDA. Es un recuerdo muy vivo de ver ese sufrimiento en gente que ya había pasado un poco por ahí, y entonces los veías volver a pasar, ¿no? Yo también estaba en el carro, yo estaba infectado en aquella época también por hepatitis C, y aunque mi situación era diferente porque tenía el hígado estaba bien y demás, pero no dejaba tampoco de estar preocupado por mi situación, por mí mismo. Entonces era una manera de ayudar a los demás y ayudarme a mí mismo, el comprender, el entender bien cómo podemos mejorar esto.
La Spagna aveva un'alta prevalenza di persone coinfette che stavano morendo, e quindi era un'emergenza, e quindi anche per rimarcare il fatto di farlo in un paese del sud Europa dove veramente questa era un'emergenza. erano molto dedicati al tema dell'epatite e loro avevano già sentito il bisogno di costruire un network solo mirato al tema della coinfezione, perché antecedente appunto a Sitges, dopo gli anni 2000, si formò questo gruppo che si chiamava Senca e questo si occupava solo di coinfezione con epatite C e anche di tutte le implicazioni a 360 gradi, non solo sul diciamo così il trattamento, ma anche tutti gli aspetti sociali che portava dietro la coinfezione, perché per esempio la terapia standard di quel periodo, interferone ribavirina pegilato, era una terapia estremamente complessa.
Por eso nos juntamos en España, había un consejo asesor comunitario entonces que se llamaba FEAT, Foro Español de Activistas en Tratamientos. Yo era el presidente durante una época y lo que hicimos fue poner por primera vez la hepatitis y la coinfección encima de la mesa, porque era una situación de la que no se hablaba. Había unos tratamientos que no funcionaban, había exclusión a las personas con VIH de los trasplantes hepáticos y lo único que se hacían eran cuidados paliativos, prácticamente como en los inicios del SIDA. Claro, eso había que cambiarlo. Empezamos unas reuniones en Bilbao que se llamaban los encuentros de coinfección, y a raíz de esos encuentros, que primero fueron solo españoles, decidimos, porque conocíamos a otros miembros del ICAP que pasaban por la misma situación, hacer un congreso donde invitamos a compañeros de Portugal y a compañeros de Italia a que se unieran a estas jornadas, y creamos una red comunitaria de activistas del sur de Europa en coinfección, SENCA. Ese fue como el inicio de que luego, como muchos éramos miembros de EATG, pues lleváramos ese impulso y esa necesidad de que desde Bruselas el conjunto de la organización tomara la hepatitis y la coinfección come una de sus prioridades.
E quindi all'interno dell'ECAB, con i colleghi e le colleghe di Spagna, Portogallo, spesso, diciamo così, monopolizzavamo anche durante le riunioni con l'industria farmaceutica, perché già insomma sapevamo che all'orizzonte ci potevano essere nuove molecole che avrebbero sostituito le terapie con l'interferone. Monopolizzavamo a volte anche forse un po' troppo, diciamo così, i meeting dell'ECAB, riportando anche la questione dell'epatite C proprio come prioritaria, e quindi a un certo punto abbiamo capito che avevamo bisogno di uno spazio tutto nostro dove poter affrontare e fare advocacy su questo tema a 360 gradi, e quindi il gruppo di attivisti di Bilbao organizzava una volta l'anno questo meeting. E da lì poi, nel momento in cui appunto all'orizzonte c'erano nuovi farmaci e quindi il nostro obiettivo era iniziare da prima di diciamo così intervenire proprio e guidare anche un po' lo sviluppo di queste nuove molecole di cui avevamo assolutamente bisogno, abbiamo capito che avevamo bisogno di uno spazio un po' internazionale, perché gli stakeholder sarebbero state le agenzie regolatorie, le industrie farmaceutiche, e quindi la grande mamma EATG, diciamo così, ci ha supportato per dare vita a Sitges, che fu proprio un vero progetto di advocacy sui trattamenti dell'epatite C.
Recuerdo a compañeros como Joan Tallada, Luis Mendao, Tracy Swan, que empujábamos, Juan Hernández, que empujábamos constantemente los distintos ICAPs que teníamos en Bruselas para que una reunión de este tipo se realizara. En España, porque teníamos un importante problema de personas coinfectadas, había una cantidad de muertes que era inaceptable en aquella época, que tantas personas que habían sobrevivido al VIH al final murieran por complicaciones hepáticas. Lo mismo sucedía en otros países del sur y también en algunos del norte como Escocia. y sentíamos la urgencia de que se tenía que hacer algo. Por fin, cuando se consigue que EATG dé el paso de tomar la cartera de hepatitis como una cartera propia e iniciar los encuentros de Sitges, pues sentíamos mucha responsabilidad porque era algo por lo que habíamos luchado mucho y no sabíamos en realidad si iba al final a tener un resultado importante o factible que se pudiera medir en salvar vidas, que era lo que nos interesaba.
This was a community-led initiative, and it really was the push coming from several people. I do remember that meeting from Luis where he said, you know, we need to take this up a stage and we need to create a budget for it. And I could see people round about me, you know, kind of going like that, thinking more money, more money, more money. I'm glad that we did that because we listened to what the members were asking us.
And Sitges was something different from all the other activities and the other meetings I was overseeing because there was a different level of participation. The Sitges meetings were a series of meetings, so it was like an appointment, an early appointment with the community and people concerned about the life of people living with hepatitis C. It was an advocacy moment. It was a true moment of activism again.
Sitges, diciamo così, essendo io componente delle EATG e dell'ECAB, ho contribuito anche a costruirla perché in quegli anni dove la coinfezione con l'epatite C per le persone che avevano l'HIV era una vera emergenza, era la prima causa di morte delle persone appunto con HIV che avevano risolto la questione dell'HIV, avevamo terapie che controllavano l'infezione del virus dell'HIV. Ma le persone morivano per fallimento epatico perché molti di noi avevano anche l'epatite C. L'Italia era uno dei paesi con più alta prevalenza di epatite C, avevamo il 60-65% delle persone con HIV che erano coinfette dall'epatite C e molti di loro iniziavano a morire e quindi noi avevamo questa emergenza.
Before 2007, the situation on treatment for hepatitis C, both for people co-infected and for mono-infected people with hepatitis C, we had two options that were quite clearly the same. One was sold by Roche, Pegintron and ribavirin, and the other by Schering-Plough, then MSD, that is also pegylated interferon and riba. The treatments were different. The duration of the treatments were different according to the genotype that we had, and but it went from 6 months. 1 year was the most common duration to 18 months for people that were responding but not quick enough. The side effects of these medicines were horrendous. I did one of these treatments in 2003, and I was a null responder, meaning that in the first 3 months I had no change in my viral load. So I had to discontinue, but I was in hospital for 40 days after the only 3 months of this treatment. The prices were very high, very high. In absolute numbers, the treatment for hepatitis C was more expensive, with rates of cure around 40% in the global figures. So 6 out of 10 were not cured.
era una terapia estremamente complessa che aveva molti effetti collaterali fisici sull'immunosoppressione, ti abbassava i globuli bianchi e quindi le persone che non avevano ancora un'infezione per HIV controllata erano insomma un po' veramente difficili da trattare, ma soprattutto dava forti effetti psicotropi di depressione. Essendo molti di noi ex drug user per via iniettiva e quindi sempre un po' in bilico anche con le dipendenze, con la depressione eccetera, tutti questi aspetti sociali di quella terapia dovevano essere, diciamo così, trattati, cioè le persone a quell'epoca, ma io stessa, dovevano essere formate prima di intraprendere una terapia del genere. E quindi in questi meeting che organizzavano a Bilbao soprattutto, perché c'era questo gruppo di attiviste basche erano tutti coinfetti anche loro, erano molto motivati e quindi avevano anche un sacco di soldi che gli dava il loro governo autonomo e quindi organizzavano questi meeting che all'inizio hanno tenuto solo per la Spagna, poi probabilmente anche con l'esperienza degli EATG hanno aperto per esempio anche agli italiani. Io andavo sempre lì e io lì imparai per esempio a prepararmi per me stessa ad affrontare la terapia con interferone ribavirina. Iniziai a prendere un antidepressivo prima perché era consigliato, soprattutto nel mio caso che ero sempre un po' borderline con la depressione, e preparai anche tutte le persone che erano a fianco a me a essere pronti ad avere una persona con degli sbalzi di umore o un'irascibilità un po' fuori dalle righe.
My first Sitges meeting was the first Sitges meeting. I was already doing a lot of work on hepatitis C because in New York, where I was living, there were a lot of people who used drugs who had hepatitis C, many of them also living with HIV. And while they were living with HIV, they were dying from hepatitis C. And the treatment at the time, PEG interferon and ribavirin, was very toxic, and it worked very poorly in people living with HIV. And I was doing a lot of work also with the ECAB, and Joan Tayada from GTT was very also focused on co-infection. And we would meet often at meetings and just say something more needs to be done to get people living with HIV in trials sooner. Since the disease is more aggressive in people who are living with HIV, they should not have to wait for post-marketing studies and not know for years after drugs were approved whether they would be safe and effective. So together we decided we should have a sort of think tank meeting. There was a lot of co-infection in Spain as well, to have it here in Sitges, and to bring a lot of different stakeholders together to sort of figure out what we could do to address the problem of not excluding people living with HIV from trials. And, you know, companies want to make their drugs look as good as possible. So if they're less likely to work in a particular group of people, they don't really want to study those drugs in that group. And we knew that had to change. And we also knew that there were better oral drugs coming, even in 2007. So together, we just talked about what we thought would be necessary. You know, to begin with a primer on drug development for people from the community that were great activists but hadn't done work in drug development. To talk about what was going on in the clinic, to talk about the experience that people living with HIV and hepatitis C and people who use drugs were having. They were very well represented at the meeting. And to talk about some solutions in a very constructive, collaborative manner. And it was just an amazing meeting, absolutely amazing.
So So my first Sitges meeting was after I became involved inside the European AIDS treatment group, but also at Portuguese level in the fight for research and development in HCV, and that people co-infected would not be left out of the clinical trials, at least in phase 3. This came because I was representing the EATG at World Hepatitis Day when it was in May, not now that is in July, in Copenhagen. And I remember that I finished my presentation saying, we need new drugs, better drugs, more efficient, and at affordable prices. So it was a kind of a comprehensive package of what we were fighting for.
My first Sitges meeting was, I think, around about 2009, and it was here in this very hotel, the Callipolis. It was for me an eye-opener on so many levels, because it was a very mixed group, with it being a multi-stakeholder approach.
There was also a big fight. So the ugly, bad, and mean, the co-infected drug users were not treated by the hepatologists and the gastro. They were treated by the more liberal infectiologists. So there were the clean patients who had no responsibility, were not to blame because they were infected in the hospitals and the healthcare system by transfusions and other procedures, and the ones that deserved what they got, that were the people that did use or were using drugs. So a very nasty situation in Europe at that time. There was many clinicians that didn't give hepatitis C treatment for people co-infected, and even worse if they were people using drugs. This was the practice in Europe that should be the most advanced, etc. And of course, the inclusion in clinical trials was not available point. It was an exclusion criteria for the clinical trials to be HIV positive and also or to be someone using drugs.
Most of the people I worked with were people who had used or were using drugs, and doctors did not want to treat them. They were very prejudiced without having a good reason for this prejudice. But my job was to be a treatment educator, and it was very difficult because the treatment, pegylated interferon and ribavirin, we knew would not work well for people living with HIV. There was a trial that was finally done just in people with HIV and hepatitis C, and the results were terrible. So my job was very thankless. I had to go around and tell people about the treatment, tell them about the side effects, which were horrific, and included people even committing suicide. People got divorced, or their relationships collapsed because interferon and ribavirin could make people very moody. People's hair would fall out, they would feel weak and sick, and it had a very low chance of working. So I was fighting for access for something people didn't really want very much, but some of them really needed it. And I thought if they need it, it should be available to them. But the availability was really limited, and to go through treatment, it was usually a year. And, you know, interferon made people ill right away. It was like a year of living in hell, and often not to be cured. And a lot of people started dying, and dying from liver failure is a really bad death. And it was very depressing. I just thought this shouldn't be happening to anybody. It's not right. So for me, it was really a human rights issue.
The issue with hepatitis C was twofold, really. Basically, the treatments that were there were pretty awful. If you lived in Edinburgh, you could get them, but you didn't particularly necessarily want them. And the other issue was that the new drugs, drug trials just didn't include people living with HIV. It was something that had to be addressed.
Dobbiamo considerare che le terapie con interferone e ribavirina disponibili fino a quella data in quell'epoca erano comunque terapie che su di noi funzionavano molto meno. La metà, una persona con HIV aveva la metà delle possibilità di riuscire a sconfiggere l'epatite C di una persona che aveva solo l'epatite C. Questa era anche la paura che noi avevamo con i nuovi farmaci, perché avevamo capito, perché noi eravamo esperti, no? Sull'HIV, sui trattamenti, noi avevamo capito che per l'industria farmaceutica la cosa più semplice da fare negli studi registrativi magari era usare delle persone che ancora non erano in fase avanzata, dove la terapia avrebbe funzionato di più, quindi quelle che noi chiamavamo le popolazioni più facili da trattare. Questo era il nostro spettro. Noi avevamo lo spettro che questi nuovi farmaci fossero utilizzati nelle persone più facili da trattare, e questo dovevamo evitare, perché noi non eravamo facili da trattare, noi eravamo i più difficili da trattare, perché avevamo anche l'HIV. La prima cosa è stata veramente allertare anche attraverso questi meeting la community che questo era un problema che dovevamo affrontare.
You know, we weren't talking about whether to do trials. We were talking about when. And we all agreed after phase 2, because at that point, you should know what the right dose is. You should know what the side effects are, who it's safe for, and what the interactions are. And we got a real consensus among everyone that it was indeed time to do this. It still took some time to include people living with HIV in these trials, but we accomplished that. And we accomplished it in such a way that they weren't feeling like, oh, we've given you community people something. They knew it was important too. But the other thing that really weighed in our favor was for people living with HIV, there was reimbursement. So they knew they would make money from these drugs in Europe and the United States. And that was another impetus for them to do this.
And I think the principle was accepted. Yes, people living with HIV were going to be the first to have access to these drugs and need access to these drugs. Therefore, they should be in the clinical trials in their development.
There was a consultation by FDA in the United States, and also 1 year later, as usual. Europe does it 1 year after the Americans, sometimes even more in the case of PrEP. They wanted our input for the clinical design of the clinical trials for the development of HCV drugs. And I remember that both the document that we did produce to EMA, and the document that the Americans did do for FDA were almost completely rejected in the first thing. So this submission from the community document in Europe and in the United States was almost completely rejected. And even more in Europe. In FDA, there were some points that were taken in consideration. But it was strange because it was considered too revolutionary that 2 years later, after Sitges 1 and 2, they were completely accepted from beginning to the end as new possibilities to design clinical trials. I could not go to a clinical trial where I could be put in the current standard of care. That was pergolantide, interferon, and riba. So I could not have the risk of being put on that treatment because I could die. It's simply could die. So we opened the possibility of having experimental proof of concept for 10 people without comparison and see what was going there. Some of the clinical trials for boceprevir and telaprevir were already in place. We did ensure that it was mandatory that immediately after we had the results to do a phase 4 for co-infected people. And regarding the active drug users, I think that it was around 2009 probably that we had the first non-exclusion criteria, non-absolute exclusion criteria. Another thing that we put was that at least those who are in opioid substitution treatment or agonist treatment, as we say today, were not excluded. And we forced the companies to study the interactions that didn't exist between the opioids and the drugs. And somehow we knew in 2011, I think, yes, 2011, that we had a fantastic result of 10 people being treated with the later known as sofosbuvir and the later known as daclatazir. Many didn't believe that we could have a treatment without interferon. It was very common among many people. Some of us were saying, no, we need to get rid of interferon. That was also one of the biggest requests to FDA, was to allow these pilot projects, pilot clinical trials, proof of concept. And when we saw the result of these 2 drugs for null responders, people, some of them had made 6, 5, whatever, treatments with interferon, or went so bad with interferon that I could not even try it again. And we had 10 people, 10 cured in 3 months treatment.
And it's just the beginning of the battle. We've got far more to go.
So the key elements of the Sitges meeting, and I started them with Joanne, so we planned them very carefully. We planned the agenda really carefully. The first day was usually just community members, and I would give them updates on all the trial results from all the hepatitis C trials with the companies we were meeting with, and also with other companies, so they would be really familiar with the whole landscape.
A quel punto lì c'è stato subito chiaro che noi per i nuovi farmaci avremmo dovuto iniziare da subito a lavorarci, comunque dialogando sia con i ricercatori sia con l'industria che li stava per sviluppare, perché nel momento in cui sarebbero stati disponibili noi avevamo bisogno di avere tutte le informazioni scientifiche di sicurezza, di efficacia sulle persone anche con HIV, cosa che per esempio non abbiamo avuto per l'interferone e la ribavirina. In più, essendo molte persone con la coinfezione in fase avanzata di malattia, avevamo bisogno di dati sulle persone in fase avanzata, cioè come sarebbero stati questi farmaci, efficaci, non efficaci.
Pero decidimos que lo que era el espacio físico fuera más acogedor, como intentar abrazarlos un poco para que de esa manera fueran más permeables a nuestras demandas. Entonces, la elección de esta ciudad, entre otras cosas, era porque permitía esa interacción más de tú a tú y no tanto de exposición desde el punto de vista de la farma y luego nosotros haciéndoles preguntas. O sea, eso estaba, pero luego permitía también otro tipo di interazione.
Le riunioni di Sitges hanno avuto un modello, a mio avviso, straordinario. È stato un mix di advocacy a livello globale, perché alle riunioni di Sitges hanno veramente partecipato i massimi esperti di epatite C in vari settori di tutto il mondo, dalle industrie che avevano nella pipeline i DDA, i nuovi farmaci, ai ricercatori che maneggiavano le terapie allora esistenti con i loro pazienti, agli attivisti di tutto il mondo, perché partecipavano con noi anche attivisti americani, su questo tema.
The organization of the Sitges meeting required different steps. So there was a person who was hired as a hepatitis coordinator for this meeting and other activities related to hepatitis, advocacy for hepatitis C. And the meeting was planned in a way that there were moments where the different stakeholders were met separately, and also internal meetings. So there was a moment when the communities were talking to each other, the members of community were talking to each other to strategize on how to face the discussion with other stakeholders. But at the end, there was this kind of joint moment where all the stakeholders were in the same room, in the same place, and the objectives were really clear. That was also another specific features of this meeting.
On the first Sitges meeting, the great innovation was that we were able to bring together the activists, the advocates, people living with hepatitis C and HIV, but also the main experts, doctors, researchers, etc. The FDA and the EMA, that are the European and the American regulators for research and development and authorization of introduction in the market, and the industry, the companies that at the time had new molecules in development for the treatment. I think that this made it very rich, also somehow complex, but understandable in many ways for the people present.
And the key thing there is that if we wanted to address a problem, all of the people that we needed to talk to address that problem were in that room. All the people were there together. There's no good really if you're trying to address a problem which you know is layered, talking to individual layers separately, because some of them will say nothing until they know what the other one says as well. And that, to me, is what the Sitges meetings mean. It means that you've got all of the players in the room together, all trying to work collaboratively. At first, some suspicion, but I think after a while, I think what really changed, and it showed for me, not after the first Sitges meeting I went to, but some of the follow-on ones, is that people were letting their guard down. They were actually saying things they wouldn't necessarily say in other environments.
Las reuniones de Sitges son un modelo yo creo que muy interesante porque eran pedagógicas por un lado. Servía para que nosotros como comunidad tuviéramos acceso a información de primera mano del desarrollo preclínico y clínico de muchos fármacos. Con lo cual, a nivel individual y como comunidad, creo que llegamos a tener una información pues muy buena, sin ser especialistas.
So people went into the meeting with the pharmaceutical companies really well prepared. If they wanted to present the information that I already had with their own slant on it, we would be able to say, oh, we're familiar with that. You know, we want to know what your next trials are looking like because we want to have a say in their design and we want to talk to you about access and other issues. So it made the meetings very, very effective. It made everyone feel included and in like the best possible situation to contribute what their experience was and also to share what was going on in their own countries.
Some of us had the intuition, and that I can put myself in also, that because also the patents for ribavirin and pegylated interferon were about to expire, that there would be a big investment in the industry to bring new, better drugs to replace the ones that were getting out of patent. And we had the intuition that it was about to come and that we could see a revolution. Many of us never imagined that the revolution could be so disruptive as it was in the end. But we wanted to be there.
Quindi a livello globale un grande progetto di advocacy che però ha avuto delle ricadute locali, soprattutto in questo caso parlo dell'Italia, dei paesi del sud Europa, enorme, perché nel frattempo noi facevamo formazione, essendo stato un progetto che è durato 10 anni. Ogni anno noi avevamo degli aggiornamenti su quello che era la terapia migliore in quel momento, aspettando il futuro. E tutte queste informazioni, che erano informazioni veramente che prendevamo dai massimi esperti del mondo, arrivavano poi nei paesi locali, quindi sapevamo come gestire, come aiutare le persone che dovevano iniziare una terapia in quel momento con interferone e ribavirina, sapevamo cosa voleva dire avere 2 logaritmi di riduzione al primo esame dopo la terapia di carica virale. E quindi, diciamo così, oltre all'advocacy a livello globale, ha avuto un impatto molto forte sulle nostre comunità.
De nuevo, como con el VIH al principio, las agencias reguladoras vieron que la comunidad tenía una voz y que la voz de la comunidad era importante y que estábamos más preparados de lo que ellos se podían pensar y que bueno, teníamos propuestas a tener en cuenta y que finalmente pues se llevaron a cabo. Un éxito no, muchos éxitos y sobre todo el fundamental, las millones de vidas que se han salvado gracias a los cambios que se produjeron en los encuentros de Sitges. Y la lástima, la rabia de que muchas personas no se pudieran beneficiar de lo que luego ha venido. Pero sí, felicidad por lo conseguido. Se puede replicar.
Di nuovo in queste riunioni, in questi meeting di Sitges, rispetto diciamo a quello che facevamo all'interno dell'ECAB, era sicuramente una omogeneità del pubblico e degli attivisti che partecipavano a quegli incontri, così come anche avere, quando invitavamo degli stakeholder tipo l'industria farmaceutica o altri ricercatori che ci servivano, erano veramente le persone giuste. Eravamo tutti lì con lo stesso obiettivo.
So I think what was really original from the model, it was like the ability of the HIV community to readapt the advocacy model to a new situation. So the new emergency was how do we deal with hepatitis C? And we, as a community, HIV community, we had this model already from the past, and there was an element of creativity. So to get this further, we need to talk to pharma, we need to talk to regulators, because without an approval from the regulators, things will not change, especially when we are talking about clinical trial processes. We need to talk to the local policy actors. So there was really like reinventing the model and adapting to a new situation.
This was the first time we'd had all of the researchers, the doctors, the pharmaceutical company, key pharmaceutical company representatives, some of them themselves doctors helping on the clinical trials, and the regulatory agencies all in the one room.
We were already convinced at Johnson & Johnson that the collaborative approach with different stakeholders was much better to solve broader issues that one only company like ours could not solve alone. With our experience, with the long collaboration experience we had with the European AIDS Treatment Group, we were interested in understanding how this could work by bringing in other stakeholders, like, of course, the healthcare providers, but also the regulators.
I think one should not underestimate that in contrast to many other chronic diseases, the role of community is so different in HIV. And I think you can only push things if people have a voice. It's very difficult for just clinicians or other stakeholders to pronounce their interests. There can be bias by commercial interests. There can be bias by fame and glory. I think if people living with a chronic condition speak up, that's the best way to transform medicine and really lead to changes, which also captures people into what we're planning to do, because it was, a time when the old therapies were very toxic. Many people living with HIV and hepatitis were afraid of these therapies. So there was also a big pull against using new therapies because they said, well, the toxicities, is it really for us prime time to start this therapy? So having community on board also means that you then have peers who will help you roll out advances in medicine.
So the thing was, firstly, to, in a sense, make the world aware, including the regulatory system aware of what was happening and the need to respond appropriately to that. I think the discussions we had resulted in, well, firstly, we had the European-wide recommendations for compassionate use of sofosbuvir and the NS5A inhibitors. I think that was very much informed by community input. The second thing was the way we labeled these products. Previously, products for hepatitis C had been labeled for patients with genotype X, having or not having, advanced liver disease. There were very specific labels, and here we understood that these products ultimately would work for everybody. So we ended up with treatment indication, therapeutic indications, saying for the treatment of chronic hepatitis C, and this was an attempt to facilitate access, even when there were for understudied patient populations where you could still extrapolate that this would be a good thing.
La necessità di avere al termine del primo meeting di Sitges nel 2007 una dichiarazione di intenti sottoscritta da tutti quelli che avevano partecipato è stata fondamentale, perché noi abbiamo messo in chiaro i nostri obiettivi e li abbiamo condivisi con tutti gli stakeholder, e tutti quelli che poi sarebbero arrivati in questi meeting successivi sapevano che quello era l'obiettivo, e da lì non potevano scostarsi dicendo questo non lo possiamo fare, questo è difficile. Chi veniva in quel meeting aveva ben chiaro cosa gli si sarebbe stato chiesto, e questo è stato fondamentale per riuscire poi a concludere egregiamente questo progetto.
And our motto was based on science, on safety, on risk take that each one of us wanted or not to take, that we would not have to wait for after the approval, after the phase 4 trials, to have the first people with HIV that could be treated for hepatitis C. And this was the big discussion in that first Sitges meeting, that came out with a beautiful written declaration, and people did sign, including the industry, to some principles on that. So this was really beautiful done by Tracy Swan. And we did work a lot. They did work a lot. We did contribute for the success of the first Sitges meeting.
So the first Sitges meeting was absolutely amazing. It went better than we could even imagine. And suddenly we realized we hadn't planned a closing. We had planned everything else really well. We had great presentations from community members and activists and lots of information and great speakers. But we thought, how do we close this? And I looked at Joanne and I said, why don't we ask everyone in the room, what are you leaving with as a thing you think is most important that needs to change with hepatitis C? And I wrote it all down. I took notes. And the next day we were talking and we decided, we ought to make a declaration. It was never planned, but we worked on it, and people in the companies took it very, very seriously. We sent it to all of them. We asked them to sign on. And I think the most sympathetic people signed it first, but then when one company sees it, they're like, of course, I have to sign it. And it was all about advancing drug development for hepatitis C in people living with HIV and people who use drugs. And it was also about what stage, what studies we needed first, what to do with certain populations, like people who were waiting for or needed a liver transplant, et cetera. And it turned out to be a master strategic document. But that's because it came right from the community and people living with HIV and hepatitis C. Like, they knew what was necessary. And we were able to put it together in a very clear format. And I know several other meetings started issuing declarations afterwards. And we were really happy to see that, because it's a very good way to get your messages across and to make sure that there's some action, not just, we had a great meeting, and then nothing happens from it. So it was a very good output. But it was totally spur of the moment. We didn't plan it.
We were a few people, very knowledgeable, very open to learn, that were on the right side of history at all the different levels, because sometimes you have the people that only know about science, the people that only know about prices, the fights with pharma or the collaboration with pharma, the relations with regulators and governments, etc. And I think that we had it all here gathered in the Sitges meeting.
The objective was originally to include people living with co-infections, hepatitis C co-infection, in clinical trials, which were not accessible. Once that step was reached, the clear objective was access to medicine and enlarge also the access to the trial to as many people as possible, because the people were still dying for hepatitis C. There was a solution, and there was no clear understanding of how this medicine could be delivered to these people.
That's why if you look at the titles of the Sitges meetings, they are evolving year after year to change what is the main problem at that time. Sitges 2011 was the year that we said, now it's about access. We have done it, the research, and now it's about access.
So there was the moment when the drugs were approved, there was, I think the collaboration changed. At that point, there was a highly effective therapy out, and people still were dying because the price that was put on this drug was so incredibly absurd. So at that point, it turned in a bit less collaborative manner, and the community start asking or expecting that the price of the drugs were dropped.
Well, another thing that was in Sitges meeting was that we were all very aware from the community, but from the community, that the prices that would come would be excessive, not to say obscene or other things, and that we needed to prepare to the fight of access. And also because we were from the HIV field, we did know how long it took before considering treating people outside of the rich countries. And so we had several layers of thinking of how to prepare for giving access, fighting for affordable prices, forcing the industry to release the drugs for the low middle income countries. It was a huge fight.
Tuvimos que luchar mucho también a nivel de acceso, y yo creo que tenemos que aprender de lo que hicimos y de lo duro que fue luchar porque fuera accesible los precios y los nuevos fármacos cuando ya funcionaban en los distintos países del sur. Tenemos que aprender de eso para que siga existiendo esa presión para que sean fármacos accesibles en zonas donde en la actualidad sigue habiendo una prevalencia de hepatitis C alta, como en algunos países de centro-oeste de Europa y de los Balcanes y zonas también de Eurasia, y pensar en todo lo que se hizo con las farmacéuticas para que intentaran llegar a acuerdos factibles con los gobiernos para poder tratar al máximo número de personas.
I have to say, when those drugs were priced, it felt like the most hideous and disgusting betrayal. The greed was incalculable. And I remember saying, well, you know, HIV drugs, they're like buying a house. You pay a mortgage for your whole life. But with hepatitis C, you just buy the house. And I was like, well, a lot of us are sleeping on someone's couch. What are you going to do for all of us? The later meetings were really hard because basically I remember them as just fighting with the companies and everyone being really, really angry. Although some people at this meeting on a national level were able to secure access to treatment and get really good deals, and they were instrumental in that. And they were also able to say to their communities, when the first drugs came out, boceprevir and tolapivir, that needed to be taken with interferon and ribavirin, if you can wait, there's something better coming. It put us ahead of the game in terms of advising ministries of health, advising communities, talking with doctors, and really being very successful in advocating for access in high-income countries. Low and middle-income countries took a different path because they had to, or else they wouldn't have been able to treat their people. You know, it was a really bitter lesson. We were all really invested in the development of these drugs and excited and happy. And it was like having someone pour a bucket of ice water over your head while you were outside in the freezing winter. It was just infuriating.
Barcelona was one of the centers of the activism around hepatitis C and coinfection. They had even 2 cabs in Barcelona, so you can see there was even some fights or competition between different activists, etc. And Juan and others said, we need to have a nice location. So we also used to come in October, so after the big season, that you are relaxed, not in a big city, that we can eat, sleep, see the views, looking at the sea. Some of them look at the beautiful boys, etc. Just a reminder, there was a moment when the industry started to hire desirable men for gay men that come to Sitges, and we had to warn you cannot sleep with pharma. So if anything happens, was the day before when they didn't know yet who was pharma and who was not pharma. But this was a marketing strategy from the companies.
We decided, actually, it was Joanne, to have the meetings in Sitges because it's a fabulous place to come. And if you want people to come to your meetings, they're more likely to show up if you have it in a nice place. I also think it says a lot about how you think of the community people, what the meeting's like. If it's a terrible hotel, if things are awful, people don't feel respected or valued.
The actual venue was very good. That gave me a very good feel. And it made me feel like, as a community member, I was valued, that I was being treated with respect coming into a very nice environment. Also a very nice environment to relax and let your hair down a little bit more then, because I did have more hair in those days.
Joanne Toyota, who planned the meetings with me, was a strategic mastermind. If you want people to come to a meeting, have it in a fabulous place, and they will come.
I was not very happy, I must confess, with the location. Because I said, oh my God, we are going to this gay paradise in Spain, and we are talking about mainly people using drugs and injecting drugs. So it was not exactly what I thought.
I think Sitges has a nice laid-back feel to it, and I think that maybe helped to, I think I said earlier on, people kind of let their guard down a bit. I think this kind of relaxed venue, Sitges, is the kind of place where people are going to feel that they can chill out a bit more and not necessarily look over their shoulder and be scared of what they're saying.
Y luego Sitges tradicionalmente tiene una historia muy, ¿cómo decirlo? Una historia de ciudad abierta, de ciudad que ya pues, en los años oscuros del franquismo y del posfranquismo se respiraba una libertad en esta ciudad que la hacía pues, muy vibrante para la comunidad LGTB y bueno, era una ciudad llena de hombres trans, de mujeres trans, no sé, era una ciudad muy gente fuera del armario. Y eso ha hecho que tradicionalmente esta ciudad se considere un punto dentro de España como proclive a producir, a ser aceptado, a que hagan cambios. Y dijimos, pues mira, se une la facilidad, se une que nos vamos a cuidar un poquito, que ya nos toca. Y tercero, que esta ciudad es una ciudad abierta y que solo la atmósfera ya va a ayudar.
We learned a lot of things, I think, within the Sitges system or the Sitges model. The first thing is that in the very beginning there was still a certain form of reluctance in some parts of the business. In the company, legal and healthcare compliance had a lot of questions about us needing to be transparent in a setting, of course, with other stakeholders present. I think we overcame that. There is a lot of trust that is needed, and the trust can only be built if you have a long-standing collaboration. That's why I think the first big learning is such models only exist if you have a long-standing collaboration. The second thing is with healthcare becoming more and more complex, I think there is more and more need for such approaches. If we want to collaboratively solve issues that we all face, the best way to do it is to come together and sit around the table.
It was clear that people were, if you like, trying to be a bit more guarded and trying not to say too much. But that would be for two reasons. One was that this wasn't just a new environment for the EATG. This was a new environment for the doctors, the pharmaceutical company. You'd very seldom get all the pharmaceutical companies in a drug disease area in the room together, and they are not necessarily wanting to give away information about where they are in their drug development. What changed over the years is that they realised that to move forward it was in their best interest to actually be, if you like, a bit more trusting of the environment that they were in. And I think that trust went in several directions, from us to them, from them to us. And I think that as the level of trust went up, I think we maybe got more information than we would otherwise have got over the years.
Y luego fue, yo creo que la primera vez que teníamos a los reguladores, pero de la FDA, de la EMA, aquí hablándonos de las necesidades que había de estos fármacos, de sus dudas como agencias reguladoras, creando un poco cómo iba a ser el camino, el paso a dar para que estos agentes fueran testados en personas con VIH y al final hacerlo una realidad. Entonces fue muy global, y con mucho cariño. Yo creo que nos cogimos todos mucho cariño. No sé, se creó un ambiente mágico en el que todos de alguna manera nos quitamos un poco nuestros sombreros que nos definen y logramos también a nivel personal crear interacciones que yo creo que al final son las que en muchas ocasiones mueven las cosas. Es esa interacción, esa amistad que surge, ese comprender al otro que tienes enfrente, el entender las distintas posiciones de la gente y el acercarlas, ese diálogo, esos paseos que dábamos hasta que íbamos a cenar, ¿no? Esos ratos libres en los que nos poníamos a charlar de manera informal, pero claro, la gente se abría también a sus preocupaciones o cómo ellos, desde siendo una farma tal, también vivían la situación, o cómo la vivíamos nosotros desde la urgencia, ¿no? de las personas que se nos morían. Los reguladores, la preocupación que tenían de que esto de alguna manera cambiara porque veían el problema tan grande que tenían. Yo creo que se creó una atmósfera muy agradable y una atmósfera donde todos fuimos muy humanos, algunos más que otros, eso siempre, pero en conjunto todos fuimos mucho más humanos en aquel momento. Logramos que nos pusiéramos en el papel del otro y se avanzó. De hecho, fue un éxito. Yo no estaría vivo a lo mejor si no hubiera sido por los éxitos de los encuentros de Sitges. ¿Cuál es el mayor éxito de los encuentros de Sitges? Bueno, no hay uno solo, yo creo que hay muchos éxitos en los encuentros de Sitges. Primero, conseguimos algo que era impensable, que las personas con VIH tuvieran acceso finalmente a los ensayos clínicos de los nuevos agentes antivirales y que se creara evidencia científica de que funcionaban. Segundo, muy importante también, conseguimos tener conocimientos suficientes para poder hacer un seguimiento adecuado a todos los fármacos que estaban en investigación y así poder, porque los primeros fueron muy tóxicos, entonces poder hacer un seguimiento de que verdaderamente lo que se estaba desarrollando iba a ser efectivo y no solamente efectivo, sino que iba a ser seguro para las personas. Y eso fue muy importante también, ganar todo ese conocimiento y conseguir luego a nivel local que las personas conocieran, porque tenían una gran necesidad de curarse, pero que conocieran cuáles eran los pros y los contras de esos primeros fármacos que surgieron. Con lo cual, ese aprendizaje y ese seguimiento fue fundamental. Tercero, conseguimos marcar de una manera clara qué era aceptable y qué no era aceptable en el acceso a los nuevos fármacos de la hepatitis C y crear un movimiento de conciencia y un movimiento popular a nivel europeo y a nivel nacional de que ciertas drogas esenciales para la población deben tener una negociación de precio teniendo en cuenta no solamente el coste por vida ganado, que eso es algo muy utilizado y obvio, sino otras circunstancias también. No todo se puede basar en que la innovación es cara y en que vas a salvar no sé cuántas vidas por año ganado. No. Hay que ir más allá en ese acceso. Y yo creo que en la hepatitis C se consiguió que al final las farmas, que en un principio estaban muy reacias a negociar precios, terminaran viendo que a mayor número de personas tratadas el beneficio iba a ser mejor y que iban a erradicar una enfermedad, y realmente se involucraron finalmente en esa lucha también de, bien, vamos a erradicar esto, tenemos los medios, vamos a hacerlo.
I'll repeat myself here again. I think the most important outcome was the fact that we got drugs for people to treat hepatitis C. And it cures them. It's not like HIV. You don't take the drugs for the rest of your life. You take them for, I think, 6 weeks is one of the treatments nowadays. And that's it, gone forever, unless you catch it again.
I think from our perspective, there were two major aspects where these meetings were very valuable. The first was the general sort of to spread the word, in a sense, of the sense of urgency with the promise of the products that were being developed. And associated with that, and perhaps most importantly, was the discussions about risk perception, particularly in situations where we had very little. On the one hand, we had drugs that seemed very safe. On the other hand, there was very little experience in patients with decompensated liver disease. And I think that the conversations that we had on this situation was very helpful for regulatory decision making.
Il risultato più importante delle riunioni di Sitges è sotto gli occhi di tutte e tutti, è stato avere al momento degli studi registrativi dei nuovi farmaci ad azione diretta per l'epatite C, avere degli studi paralleli che ci hanno permesso di capire sia l'efficacia di questi farmaci, anche se non erano studi fatti per dimostrare l'efficacia di questi farmaci sulle persone coinfette, sulle persone in fase avanzata di malattia, anche solo monoinfette, perché poi in questi meeting che abbiamo fatto negli ultimi periodi abbiamo anche coinvolto attivisti che avevano solo l'epatite C e facevano parte di organizzazioni che si occupavano solo di epatite C. Abbiamo fatto capire all'industria farmaceutica che ci poteva essere un mercato anche per curare persone che usavano sostanze per via iniettiva, perché ovviamente queste, tutte le popolazioni che loro pensavano fossero più difficili da trattare, meno aderenti alla terapia, sarebbero state escluse, e invece hanno capito che questo era solo un pregiudizio e che si sarebbe potuto curare anche persone che prendevano il metadone o magari che facevano ancora uso attivo di droghe.
It gave the community a stronger voice. It normalized the idea that people living with HIV should be included in hepatitis C clinical trials. It kind of changed the way some people looked at drug development and science to make it more inclusive, more representative, and so that when the drugs hit the market, people who were offered these drugs had a really good idea of what are the side effects, how long do I need to take this, when will I know if it's working, and how likely is it to work for me.
I meeting di Sitges hanno avuto un impatto fortissimo anche nel ridurre stigma e discriminazione in alcune popolazioni, che sempre si pensava fossero difficili da trattare. Emblematicamente sui farmaci nuovi per l'epatite C questo avvenne soprattutto sulle persone che usavano droghe per via iniettive, che erano una popolazione molto colpita dall'epatite C e anche dall'HIV, e visto che i primi farmaci avevano bisogno di un'aderenza molto costante, la nostra paura è che, come al solito, il pregiudizio li tenesse fuori, dall'accesso a queste terapie. Per cui fin dall'inizio in questi meeting iniziamo a lavorare su questo, portando il tema dell'importanza che anche persone che usavano sostanze per via iniettive dovessero essere trattate immediatamente, e questo funzionò abbastanza, perché poi alcune industrie farmaceutiche fecero quasi a livello degli studi, nello stesso tempo degli studi registrativi, sia degli expanded access, però anche degli studi per vedere per esempio le interazioni col metadone e i nuovi farmaci per l'epatite, e questo per esempio in Italia fece in modo che nei CERT, che sono i servizi che curano le tossicodipendenze, stessi medici del CERT iniziarono a prescrivere ai loro pazienti questi farmaci per l'epatite e a seguirli nella gestione.
To me, the most important, in sum up, important outcome of Sitges meeting was that I have still around some friends that I knew, including myself, that would be dead if we would not work and accelerate the process of clinical trial design, inclusion, and access. And so it's a small thing, but from my personal point of view, was this thing that we knew we were working to save people that were on the verge of being irreversibly going to death. But from brain, heart, feelings, blah, 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 I think that we had all there present in the movement that created the Sitges meetings. It was not only about fighting, it was not only about science, it was not only, but really trying to solve something that was a huge problem at the time, mainly in Europe, in the southern states like Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal.
We realised that the lesson that we'd learnt after 10 years, that this was a very successful format. Maybe it doesn't work all the time, let's be perfectly honest, because that was a unique period of time where we had companies jostling with each other with drugs to come forward, and they really needed us, we needed them. So it's not necessarily the case with everything else, but I think we realised this was a good approach to take, and I think we learnt that over the years, and I think it's something we shouldn't forget as well, because we now move forward onto other projects like the Belong project, where we're dealing with issues which are not new at all. You know, people not getting access to COVID vaccines in the trial stage, despite the fact we're the ones who get the regular boosts, etc. So,
hoy en día tenemos la situación de que seguimos siendo excluidos de muchos nuevos avances tecnológicos en medicación, precisamente poblaciones, no solo los VIH, sino otras poblaciones que en definitiva vamos a ser los principales usuarios de esos nuevos medicamentos o de esos nuevos avances en tecnología de diagnóstico, tratamiento. Entonces no tiene sentido que precisamente nos excluyan. Creo que podemos aprender mucho de lo que se hizo en Sitges para repetir ese tipo de encuentros, lograr que los estados dejen de decir, bueno, no hay evidencia científica, esto es caro, no lo financio, que las farmacéuticas dejen de decir, bueno, es que la indicación de esta droga es para todo el mundo y entonces no tengo por qué hacer estudios específicos en subpoblaciones. Ese siempre es su discurso, ¿no? Si es una droga que funciona en principio, pero bueno, la vas a usar en subpoblaciones y los que pagan necesitan saber un poco si eso va a funcionar o no. Entonces es más necesario que nunca, porque estamos otra vez con nuevos fármacos, con nuevas enfermedades en el mismo callejón sin salida que teníamos al principio de Sitges. Es muy importante reunirlos, traerlos, decisores políticos, farmacéutica, nosotros los activistas, sentarnos juntos otra vez y empezar a hacerles ver de que las sillas se tienen que mover. Las sillas no pueden estar estancadas, cada uno en su posición, nosotros siempre expectantes, lanzando preguntas y cada uno en su sitio. No, tenemos que ser lo suficientemente valientes como para empezar todos a dar pasos, ¿no? Y a mover esas sillas. Y yo creo que se puede hacer. Y yo creo que por eso son necesarios encuentros como los de Sitges.
We don't have a vaccine and we will not have it because there is no commercial interest in producing a vaccine. I and others did fight to have one shot with long-acting drug that you could be cured in one shot. It's very non-likely that we will have that, and for people that really are terrified by the health systems and the health people working in the health systems, etc., it would be fantastic. But we have the tools to eliminate as a public health problem hepatitis C. We did huge progress, but we are still lacking behind what it could be done. With the tools that we have now, probably the one that is missing more, in my opinion, is to have a very reliable test that allows you to test and treat immediately. And I couldn't imagine 15 years ago that this would be the problem that was not solved yet. But this is a matter of data. We need reliable data, comparable data to see how we are failing the 2030 objectives of Sustainable Development Goals 3.3 regarding the viral hepatitis.
And I think it really needs this bringing all the stakeholders together to make a change. And I think that's what really happened. And I think that tells us that if we have one voice, we can actually convince people of something. But it needs a dialogue. You can't just say we want this and we want that. You need people to engage, and it's much more difficult also for people from pharma to sit there and say, oh, well, people are dying from liver disease. Well, we don't really, they have to sort of react. And I think bringing everyone together, showing the evidence of the faster fibrosis progression, what that meant for people living with co-infection was really, really pivotal. And I think, 2023, where are we now with regard to fatty liver disease, which is more pronounced in people living with HIV, chronic hepatitis B? 6% of all people living with HIV have a hepatitis B co-infection. There are ongoing trials of HBV cure, and people living with HIV are excluded.
I think what we learned is the importance to understand both the perceptions of, shall we call it, the hopes of patients, what's anticipated and expected from drug development on the one hand, and the other aspect is the risk perception, to have conversations about risks with respect to clinical trials as well as compassionate use and early access.
So there is still things to be done. They are not, apart from the diagnostic and monitoring technological tools regarding drugs. The drugs are very easy to produce. In most countries outside the European Union, the drugs became affordable. It's an irony that some of the countries, if they join the European Union, they start to have a problem on affordability of the drugs because they are in the rich club, so they are supposed to pay.
I'm glad that we took it seriously on the board at the time, because this was one of the best initiatives that our memberships ever come to us with. So I wouldn't at any point want to take the credit for the board or anybody. This is the members who actually pushed us for this, and we should be thankful to them that they did push us for it.
But I think that probably millions of people, not a lot of millions, but millions of people could have a normal life because of the work that has been produced by many.
It's time to start listening to communities more about what they want and what they need, and think of a smarter, more human way to develop drugs that's just as efficient, that gets the results that we need, that gets the drugs out to the people, but that is much more humanistic, not exceedingly profit-driven.
So Belong is a project that deals with the issue of barriers for people living with HIV, non-accessing non-HIV clinical trials. The origin of the project starts from a request of a member who is participating in ethics committees and then was constantly confronted to the fact that people living with HIV are excluded from non-HIV clinical trials, despite the fact that this is having HIV diagnosis not an issue anymore. And that was discussed with the members and was clearly one of the main priorities for the future. This goes hand to hand to the fact that there is an aging population, so the risk of developing or being confronted with a non-HIV conditions is higher, but still the trials are very limited in terms of access to people living with HIV, and so there are basically not sufficient data to prove that new medicaments in other disease areas are good enough for people living with HIV. In September 2022, EATG published the position paper named "Why People Living with HIV Must Be Included in Non-HIV Trials." The objective of the project is to engage with the regulatory authorities to influence the European guidelines and remove the barriers to access to non-HIV trials. So we are now looking back at the Sitges model, but with a new perspective.
Me parece muy importante que hayáis, desde el proyecto Belong, echado una mirada hacia atrás, porque muchas veces aprendemos de lo que ha pasado antes. Si algo nos hace humanos es que estemos todavía, no sé por cuánto, pero de momento en este planeta, no sé por cuánto más, pero lo que nos ha hecho sobrevivir como especie es todo lo que nuestro cerebro ha ido aprendiendo de todo lo que hemos ido evolucionando. El perder la memoria, el perder la mirada hacia atrás, el no recuperar nuestra historia, el no aprender de lo que hemos hecho, yo creo que es extinción. Si algo nos mantiene vivos, es precisamente aprender de lo que hemos hecho y de ahí partir a lo que vamos a hacer. Gracias al proyecto Belong por echar esa mirada atrás, por recuperar la memoria y de esa recuperación de memoria aprender y mirar hacia el futuro. O sea, felicidades porque creo que estáis haciendo un buen trabajo y este documental es una prueba de ello.